So Chris is going to set up some chairs up front, and what I'd like all of you to do is, the notion of a fishbowl basically is to have a discussion that is very lightly moderated, if at all. This is not a panel discussion, but basically we're going to set up some empty chairs up here. The theme of this is going to be implementation experience, and anyone who would like to share a question or an experience can literally get up, have a seat, share what it is they want to share with the group. When they're done, they get up and go back to their seat. And multiple people can come up at the same time. If you want to directly participate, you come up and sit in an empty chair. If you just want to listen, you stay where you are. And the only rule is that we should focus on actual experience, not on opinion. And we find that if we focus on actual experience, we can stay away from rhetorical argument and actually start finding the gold in the conversation. So the other thing I'd like you to do so that we have a bit more of an organic structure here is if you could pivot your chairs slightly so it's less of an audience, stage, proscenium stage structure, but just a little bit more of a circle, so we're looking at each other a bit more. Just pivot a few degrees. Because bowls are circular, they're not square, right? Yes?
Can we ask questions of the fish bowlers, or do we have to come up and take a chair to ask?
Yes. Roger's question is, if you have questions for people who are up here, do you do it from the floor or do you come forward? Now, we've got the empty chairs, and people should start to come up and be brave and start sharing their experiences. Stood.
Get the other speakers up so long. Someone posted something on the wiki about why implementation is so slow in Tanzania. Can those people come up?
So should I speak or wait?
Sure, go ahead and start.
Hi, I'm Amir Khan. I work in Pakistan, and we've been implementing OpenMRS for the last 2 years. One specific component of OpenMRS that we're really very happily using is the MDR-TB module. And our experience has been that for almost every implementation that we use of the software, we end up having a separate server. So you have a server that's running OpenMRS MDR-TB module. You then have a separate server that's running in the OpenMRS for our community outreach programs. The third one for another sort of project implementation. And it's a question we're asking ourselves, very focused question in terms of like, what are the hardware requirements and why we can't simply sort of install or have multiple installations of the same software on one server and actually make it work well for us. It's a very specific issue. It's one that we're struggling with because we just end up having to implement a new server for every OpenMRS project use.
I guess the first question is, you're actually having hardware, like you're seeing performance issues with if you installed, like if you did all the programs in one?
Yeah. So often there are conflicts. One of the implementation stops working or slows down, and then because we're also integrating them often with mobile, data collection or GIS visualization, it's almost as though you have to have a separate server for each implementation.
And have you been able to pinpoint what area that is slowing down? Is it everything? Is it just the transactional system itself?
I think it's. I mean, I don't have the technical term for it. I'm just reminding everybody I'm not the IT person. But in terms of the data sharing and data movement, the speed of the software really slows down. People who are entering information at the hospital end in the program and complain about.
Can't hear you.
So the people that are using these systems, if you have more than one implementation of OpenMRS on the server, then start complaining about the speed because they say we're searching for patients, we're trying to pull up information or enter data, and it stops functioning. So we've had to separate them onto separate servers. And it just might be our lack of experience with running multiple implementations on a single server. But it would really help to be able to sort of not get a new server for every project that uses OpenMRS.
And are the servers on the local area network, like everyone
They're-
has access, or like,
No,
like the workstations, or are the servers like?
no, there's like a dedicated server room with, they're just dedicated to that specific,
But they're accessible from, like, say.
from a LAN, from within the hospital or within the.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know that I have an answer to that, but is there anyone else who is sort of doing similar things and experiencing either the same problems or not experiencing those problems? Running sort of multiple OpenMRS things going on at the same time on the same server? If so, feel free to come up and talk about it.
I don't get to geek out as much as I used to, but I know that we are running multiple instances of OpenMRS on our servers. And I know I remember conversations on the dev list about doing that. So I know it's possible to have multiple instances. It may be the issue. I think we have a separate database in MySQL and a separate WAR loaded for each one, so it's not kind of an auto install. You can kind of have one instance of Tomcat serving up multiple. Is that right? But I'm pretty sure that Ben might be able to comment on some of the technical stuff, or some of the developers could talk in terms of how technically that's done. I don't know. This is we need to go into the detail
I
here.
think in order to answer that question, we have to know like what your hardware looks like, for a certain
Microphone.
what we would need to know like what hardware you're using and go through like actual like performance review and see what is it the software or is it the hardware limitation or a hardware limitation.
One thing that I was going to say is, on behalf of the MDR-TB module.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm
for the
sorry.
people-
I'm Dave Thomas. I'm a Java programmer for Partners in Health, and I wrote the MDR-TB module. So one of the challenges that actually there's a new version of the module, and that's something that I very much need to talk to you about this week. But one of the challenges is that the MDR-TB module depends on a fairly large set of metadata, including something like 250 concepts. And so in this next version, something that we have been doing is thinking about how to cache those in a way such that there aren't database reads. For example, every time that a new page loads, we don't want to reload all of this information. And that's actually something that I want to talk about in a breakout session, but just basically sort of content caching and what we can do with that in order to speed up the application. Because form entry is one thing, but if you're actually having to load 250 concepts every time you want to look at a web page, there are technical things that we can do to speed that type of thing up. So that's a whole issue that I want to talk about on behalf of the MDR-TB module.
And just another question, when you're saying you're running multiple instances of OpenMRS, what's the reason behind that?
The reason has been because when we tried to have 2 instances or more on the same server, one started giving us problems. And so we ended up then just separating the servers, and that seems to solve the problem. And it works if you have 3 or 4, but then you have space and cost limitations after that. So.
Are they running the same program or separate programs?
At this time, I think we have 3 implementations, perhaps 3 implementations, to do this correct to me. One is an MDR-TB module and 2 OpenMRS on their own separately. So they're the same versions, the 2 OpenMRS are the same version of this software.
All right, the reason for these questions is I proposed a while back, and I think Philippe Boucher has done work with the OpenMRS Express, which is focused program OpenMRS installations. And rather, that brings up an issue of having to install multiple OpenMRS instances. If you're going to have a TB system and an HIV system, you're separating the single platform that we're working off of. And it's something I'd like to chat about a little later in the week around content-based modules or components. And there is a page on the wiki for those who are interested in reading a bit more about it.
How many people here are involved with any kind of OpenMRS implementation? So a few people. And how many people have their system running perfectly and not having any problems with it whatsoever? Yeah. So I mean, I would, we can solve specific development or technical problems, but I would invite anybody that is running an implementation. One of the things that we, one of the values I think that we try to put forward with OpenMRS is the notion of active transparency, which is the idea that we don't just try to show off the things we're good at, but we are honest about the things that we're struggling with, and we get them out there because it's the best way that we can get them improved. So. It doesn't necessarily need to become a session of, well, this doesn't work and this doesn't work and this doesn't work. But I have to believe with the group that we have here of people with different implementations, different sites, that we can learn from one another. The developers can learn, hey, this is where our priorities are, and you might find that some of these implementations have found workarounds for issues that you're having. So I would urge you to use this fishbowl, come here, and try to get some of those issues out so that we can start that conversation.
I wonder if there's something specific that your users were doing that maybe was slowing the system down. We have one single implementation, but for example, if we run some data exports, some reports, it will make the system appear unresponsive for other users. So that might be something to look at.
Right, and I don't expect to have technical solutions to the problem here on this forum, but I'm just trying to question whether that's the thinking going into the development of the software, where we are going to have institutions that have multiple instances of the software running, whether it's for the vertical programs or then adding that onto a hospital-based database, and how we're thinking around a single installation that lets everybody work off that same installation.
So I did mean to ask, is the intention to have separate patient databases, or in a perfect world, would you just have a single server, a single database, all the patients are in there, everyone and all their data is intermingled?
It's a good question. I think for ourselves, we'd like one single database where you can actually have whether it's a program in the community or the patient hospital, it's just one single database. But we often come across partners who then have their own structures and have their own security requirements and needs, and so you often end up having a second or a third or fourth implementation because somebody else needs it.
I just want to add, it can be pure ignorance here, but it's a question out to the OpenMRS developers, whoever. Is there an option for users to have complete access to a particular group of patients as opposed to everyone that's entered in the OpenMRS database? Is that available now or not?
Is anybody working on the role-based login module?
There is at least one module that does let you do that, but not very well.
Okay.
There may be others.
So that's probably also that's essentially the other reason for having 3 different implementations of OpenMRS.
is there anyone out there who, no, is there anyone out there, sort of sitting out there, who wants to be able to limit access? You know, only certain users are only allowed to see certain patients in a way that's not currently done. And if so, would you like to come up and talk about it?
So we're running a program at the moment, or a development for a group of doctors in Johannesburg. It'll be an online distributed OpenMRS installation with a group of 30 different practitioners is the starting number. And we've done some customization to the HTML forms module to allow what we call subscription to various programs, which is synonymous with the word forms in our context here. Now what that has given out to us is this need that particular doctors or providers may only require to see those patients enrolled on the HIV program or the contraception program. And at this point we're up against a bit of a brick wall in terms of how to restrict particular providers to only seeing those patients, or at least providing that option to the client. And what we have been able to restrict is patients, the provider will be able to search for a patient, and if they're on the program, they can either see the forms or not see the forms, but the rest of the data will be available to them.
Yes, well, my requirement in this area is that we have people who are up-referred for certain parts of their care and then down-referred, so they need to share their program, but only when they're up-referred should the people in the up-referring facility be able to see it, or if they have a child, you know, then the child starts off in the hospital where the mother gave birth and then moves over to the children's hospital for ongoing care. So then the children's hospital needs to be able to look at the mother's birth record for maybe a short period of time, but not forever. You know, there's just in terms of who's responsible for the patient's care at that time. I know that we have in a lot of hospitals sort of like separate filing systems for the ARV, the HIV patients, okay, and that might be an instance of a program-based restriction that people would want, but because we're focused only on that, primarily on that program now, we don't experience it as a boundary need.
So one thing that we're thinking of looking at is a module for VCT, and as part of VCT, obviously needing to look at privacy of a particular type of data within a file. So, for example, saying only certain people can see an HIV result, we're looking at moving towards a primary care system, so that we can sort of restrict access to a piece of information within a file based on a role. And then also, as someone I think put up on the wiki, having location-based restrictions so that clinicians from one health center can only see them. And then that ties into what he just said, being able to transfer. And then how do you transfer that access if a patient transfers? Is it just changing the location and then it works? But if you're transferring up or down to hospital or back down, sort of dealing with those permissions too.
Hi, I'm Andy Kanter from the Millennium Village Project, and I just arrived, so I want to say hello to everybody. We actually have going to have a fairly large group of people here from each of our sites. If for those people that don't know, the Millennium Villages were primary care settings in fairly rural parts of 10 different countries. And we've been struggling a little bit on the implementation side. A lot of it has to do with just the human resource capacity in our sites. That is a big issue, and I think we'll be much more talk about that as we're building through the week. But one of the things that I think has improved a lot was the versioning and of the software as it comes out. Although we still have issues going from one version to another in terms of things breaking or parts of the admin page disappearing. But I think the part that we're really struggling with right now is this the issue of a multi-site implementation, where in our Uganda site, for example, we have a wide area network, and which is fine. So we have one server essentially with different 6 facilities entering data into the system. But in our other 2 sites, or 3 sites that in Ghana, in Rwanda, and in Kenya, we had one clinic up and running, and then the question is, how do we expand to the next clinic, and do we try to create a wide area network and keep the one server, or do we set up a federated sort of system and then use remote data entry and things like that? And so synchronization, we've struggled with that whole issue and have chosen not to go to the branch with that, so I think this is one of our key issues. But I think the question that just was raised has been brought up by our primary care folks in the sense that they feel like there's a certain likelihood of patient mobility within the cluster of clinics. And therefore, unlike maybe protecting HIV data and wanting to keep that to a select group of people, we really are feeling like we want the data to be made available everywhere. And actually, I think there's some issues from a clinical standpoint. As a physician, treating a physician, I would be concerned about having data that I don't know about that was entered somewhere else in another system that I don't have access to. So I think this whole question about whether data should be restricted from view, at least as far as we're looking at it right now, the HIV issue aside, we want to make the data available to all people all throughout the system, because we do think that at least in some of our areas, patients will go to different clinics at different times. And so I'm wondering what people's strategies are for expanding beyond a single server system. And I don't know, maybe the empath folks certainly have some experience with this on remote data entry, but anyone else?
All right, I'll try to do an impression of James. So a couple issues I know at the ANPATH site in Kenya we have that we're dealing with issues of slowness that you mentioned, James, of the when you do queries on the system and it's slowing down. We actually replicate our server, so we use the MySQL replication and have a separate server running to do queries against, which has helped in terms of offload the query, that slowing down the system. And I can tell you that synchronization is a very, very high priority in terms of OpenMRS at large, in terms of trying to get that pushed through so that we can have separate servers and be able to synchronize across them. And there's been a lot of work in making that happen and turn that, actually get the core such that it can have that capability, and then take the synchronization process and put that into a module so that I think that's it's not necessarily rolled out yet, but it's I know that work is being done in Rwanda, and that we're desperate to have that functionality in Kenya, and I know other sites would want it as well.
Is there, in the technical talk, I don't know if that's been part of the hackathon that occurred earlier, but is the approach still going to be the same Hibernate approach, or is there a different looking, because when talking to Ed from Instead and so on, and the Mesh 4X kind of technology, we just wondered whether or not there might be another whole way about synchronization. Is that going to come up specifically during this week? Or?
It might, it could. Marosh isn't here, so Darius or somebody who's worked closer on sync could answer.
The answer is that for now, the first thing that we build and release is going to just take the exact same, take the same Hibernate approach, but just instead of being a branch, we'll move it to be a module. I think we are definitely not satisfied with that as being the be-all and end-all solution. So we definitely welcome figuring out a better way to do it. I mean, the first thought is just to take the same approach, but capture that through the API and not through Hibernate in a way that's slightly better, but still has some of the same limitations. So, if there are other people who have technical ideas about other ways to do data synchronization, talking about that would be most welcome.
Yeah, I'd like to see it come through the HL7 side. We should just be able to replicate patient records across, the HL7 import is a little bit weak right now in terms of what it can handle, and maybe just define a new message where you can request everything for a particular patient ID after a certain date, something like that, and just get.
So I know there's development going on in other aspects of my life back home, and using CDAs or using essentially documents that describe a patient to try to transfer data about a patient from one to another. I think probably technically we could probably do more efficient ways of synchronizing when we kind of own both sides of the pond and do something that can work more efficiently than disparate systems. But in terms of getting data in, other things we've been playing with, folks might know about the remote form entry module, and that was created with the notion of being able to, when you don't have any connection, to do some data entry, queue it up, and then bring it in centrally, which isn't necessarily the perfect solution, but we've gotten by in Kenya, in Eldoret, using that model. The notion was to try to get data enterers out by the docs in the clinics, so that there could be rapid feedback and the encounter form wouldn't have to leave the clinic. And that, I've heard rumblings that we might be kind of changing our mind a little bit about that. I don't know if James or somebody could speak to that, but and that it's not an all win to have the person out remotely. Another things we've been talking about is the idea of scanning the forms and then getting an electronic copy, not just for to bring those or try to get those in centrally and enter them centrally. It could be independent of where the data is entered, but then to have a scanned copy of the form allows you to allow the paper to go back into the chart and data entry to happen asynchronously, and also gives you a nice record to be able to go back and say, oh, well, I want to look at the actual form that was filled out for this patient and be able to pull that up. And I think I can't remember what aspect it was. Maybe I'm trying to remember who was using a mobile device. They had a USB-powered scanner that really sounded interesting.
So this is very intrigued by the remote data entry piece, and one of the things that we're currently doing in Uganda is that the forms do leave to get entered into another place and then have to go back. And so we're having issues about large numbers of forms, and there's 40,000, 50,000 encounters already in this so far, and so it's getting a lot of paper. But the whole notion of that the forms are entered on a machine locally, then those files are essentially zipped up, brought over to a central server, imported into the central server, and then a copy of the database is brought back again for the use. So everyone's not familiar with that kind of process. Then the people could still use OpenMRS locally, but the data is a static version of what was on the central server. How is that working in terms of both the amount of time and the size of the database moving back and forth, and are people happy having static versions of it?
I knew we could get James up here.
Okay, what you're doing is we have multiple servers. We have one central server.
Can't hear you.
We have multiple servers. One of them is central. That's where that's where the form processing is done. Then on each site we have a remote server, and what really happens is forms are entered, and once they are submitted, they are not processed on the remote server. They are put in a file, and then that once the entry is finished, the OpenMRS is able to create a zip folder, a file of all the forms. This is taken back to the central, where it's imported, and the forms are processed at that time. We have a number of challenges with that, because at the end of the day, we still have the movement of the forms, but at least not in paper form. What we are moving is soft copies of the forms, the XML forms, back to central for processing. One of the major issues we have is from reporting, the reporting aspect. Reason being, the distances of these clinics is quite far. So what we're doing right now is you're bringing forms back once per week for processing. Meaning within 1 week we have to get the forms into central server and then back to the remote sites to have that taken back to that database. every time the remote server can't process the forms. Reason, every time you take back the data, the database on the remote server is overwritten, meaning if you process anything on the remote server, you won't get it after synchronization. So it's one of the challenges that we have, and I don't know, okay, we are still thinking how to handle that one. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Sure, I'd just like to make some comments on that. The problem here is really the total cost of ownership. And so the vision that we've had for using OpenMRS is in a sense to have a situation like Andy and Millennium Villages project have in Uganda, where you have decent internet connectivity or wide area network between the sites so that you can have one server and you have essentially real-time view and data entry for all those sites. Now the problem with that is, of course, that a lot of sites don't have internet or don't have good internet. And synchronization was a response to a specific set of issues in Rwanda where there wasn't access to wired internet. And so we were using satellite internet connectivity not only in the peripheral sites but also in the site where the main server was, which is Runkwavu. And although the ostensible bandwidth is enough to do that work, the latency of having 4 jumps up and down to the satellite just made it an impossibility. And so synchronization was really a response to that situation of creating a virtual internet connectivity when in fact it was too slow to really support direct data entry. And so the idea is that the data is actually synchronized in semi-real time, or in cases where the internet has gone down, you can continue to work for days or potentially weeks, but of course you're getting further and further out of synchronization with the central site. So that's really what we're trying to do, to make it seem to the users, both in terms of the staff doing the data entry and the local staff who use that data, and includes in some cases physicians looking up data, that they have a copy of that data that is current and which is correct. But I think synchronization is a good example where it's a really sophisticated, large project, and really it requires a larger dedicated team and funding to make this work really well in a way that's robust enough to take such a mission critical system and really deploy it into sites all around the world.
One of the things in my other life is looking at resource constraints in terms of servers and single server implementations, but to look at, first of all, clustering, and secondly, virtualization on those clustering implementations. So that's something perhaps we can chat about, but also to use perhaps older hardware that's already there. So it's not about putting new equipment in, but to use older equipment as well.
My name is Evan Waters. I'm from the Malawi Partners in Health Project. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about the general Malawi perspective on exchanging of patient data. There's been a lot of talk about trying to create a data warehouse in Malawi, where data is getting sent from a lot of different people using systems, not necessarily all OpenMRS systems. It could be other medical record systems as well. Getting sent up to this one place and then hopefully getting used at that level, but also maybe being able to be sent back down to users. And I think that there's still not a great idea of exactly how that's going to be done, but I think that one of the things that seems to be coming out of that is the idea that we need to be able to pull just small chunks of data rather than full sets of data. The Baobab developers, who I think are coming but are not here yet, have been working on just a demographic exchange. So they're creating barcodes with patient identifiers, and they want to be able to scan an identifier and then just pull that patient's record from a system, as opposed to pulling the entire system. And I think there's just, it's made me think that there's a lot of value in being able to just pull the data that you want from a system and not the whole system. And I think it could work on a number of different levels. Concepts, pulling just the concepts that you want for a particular form, or the drug set that you want, or all of the patients from a particular clinic like we were talking about before, or maybe having just a list of every single identifier that had been assigned nationally for a program, and then if you get a patient who comes into your clinic with that identifier, you enter their data, and then when you have connectivity, you can sync with the system to get all of the records for that patient. So just want to kind of throw that out there as a different approach for synchronization at some level.
Hello, my name is Eric. I work for Faces Nyanza. We use the remote form entry model and cover about 50 sites in Nyanza province. How we do it is we have the main site in Kisumu, and then the other sites, the other 40 plus sites are in the larger Nyanza province, and we use laptops as the remote for entry servers. So we have about 15 to 20 laptops that cover like the other districts. So the data clerks roll from each site to the next to the next. So each laptop is configured for about 5-6 sites, and within the week, in each and every day, they go as per the clinic roles. They go with the clinic team, the CEOs and the nurses, and they enter the data there. The challenge we have is now after the forms are collected, we get a daily upload. At first, we're doing it daily, but the form load was becoming too much, so now we do it weekly, and they upload to us by FTP. We have about 15 servers, remote servers, so those are 15 uploads every week, and then they need to be processed, and after processing, then you send back the return data. As the file becomes larger and larger, it becomes difficult to send back that return data. So that is the one challenge we're facing. Again, the issue of user administration, because if new users, new data clerks come on board, they're registered at central, but not on the remote side, so the remote side becomes a bit tricky to get the server there. But it's working quite well so far, and it's a good addition, I believe.
Some aspect coming into OMPAT is the introduction of universal IDs to remote form entry. The concept is we are moving from HIV approach to primary health care, and we are having patients being registered at remote sites, and they are supposed to, the universal ID is being rolled out in one district, meaning that if somebody is registered in one clinic, they can be seen in another clinic. And with the challenge of synchronizing once per week, somebody may go to clinic A on Monday, and then when they move closer to clinic C, they want to go for a visit. Still, you may not be able to get that patient at that clinic, meaning there's a disconnection of care. We don't have that continuity from A to C. But we are hoping that soon we'll overcome that and be able to, almost at real time, be able to view that patient's record from clinic A to C. The other issue that comes in with that is the fact that we are not looking at HIV only as compared to the beginning, meaning we are going to see more diabetes patient, TB, we have cancer going into the same database. So there's the use of programs to differentiate them, and you find there are patients who are in multiple programs. The person is in HIV program, still in diabetes, and maybe some patients prefer going to different clinics for different care. So it's a challenge that is really coming in. You want to go clinic A for HIV, you want to go clinic C for TB or cancer. So it's something that we are hoping to improve or advance so that we can have their records coming in almost real time, and you're able to get that continuity of care for them.
My name is Gilbert from Ministry of Health for Rwanda. Well, maybe on this topic, we are considering implementing OpenMRS on a big number of sites. I don't like if there is a big implementer here who has got some experience in implementing OpenMRS, because I want to hear the challenges I met, and maybe in terms of resources, if someone maybe has like data entry team and data managers in place, what does it require to have the system? For the moment, I have like one site running OpenMRS, and I know like there are some issues like when we are setting up the system for the first time, it requires some configurations and a little bit of bugs for the first time. And also I know that in need of improving the reporting way. So I want to hear from you guys, because like implementing in these sites, it's for reporting in different issues that we have for reporting, like paper and global fund issues. So I want to hear from you what has been experienced, please.
I'll go ahead and say what I was going to say and actually kind of hopefully answer part of that as well. My name is Jeremy Keaton. I'm implementing OpenMRS in Lesotho. We started out a couple years ago with doing data entry by taking pictures of forms and entering them at a central location in our capital, and we're now have been able to deploy OpenMRS on a single server that's accessed from all 7 of our clinics remotely at the site. So we've kind of been through a bunch of stages of starting out doing things by photos and then putting things in spreadsheets and now finally putting data directly into the system at the sites. And I think one thing that maybe seems very obvious in retrospect, but that took us a long time to figure out was making decisions about which data should go into the system at an early stage instead of trying to capture a lot of things that might seem kind of superficially useful, but instead trying to put things in that are going to give quick outputs for clinicians, for administrators and things like that. And the reason that I say that is because we found that just getting the system adopted, people want to see something coming out of it quickly. So if you're taking a long time to put a lot of data in the system and people aren't able to get the feedback, you don't get a process going where things are going in, people are talking about what else they need and then and improving on the system. So I guess the point is just to try and really boil down what it is that you want to get out of the system. If it's reporting, then try to get just the aggregate data that you're going to need to be able to do that kind of reporting. And then kind of build up to the higher level things of long-term patient tracking and things like that.
So I'm Bill Lober. I arrived on the same shuttle bus that Andy did, so I suppose I should say hello as well. I had a couple of comments based on things that Hamish and Evan and Burke brought up earlier. And I guess one of those was thinking about what Chris said about keeping this experience-based. In the interest of full disclosure, the experience that I want to mention isn't based on OpenMRS per se, but it's based on a similar kind of implementation. We have about 30 servers connecting about 55 sites, and so we've thought a lot about some of the same issues that this group has. So Hamish mentioned the idea of synchronization as a response to technical issues around poor connectivity, and that's certainly a problem that we faced. But we think of synchronization as really just one type of data exchange, and it's really data exchange addresses kind of a broader set of concerns than just the technical, than trying to surmount technical issues of connectivity. So we have the 55 sites that I mentioned are many different organizations, some of which are interested, some of which are very reluctant to share data with one another, and so I guess I would say that synchronization should be viewed as a specific case of a much more complicated problem of data exchange, and that the issue that you just mentioned with, in some cases that data exchange is patient level, in other cases that data exchange is aggregate. It's really important to kind of carefully define what the business rules are in the fabric of exchange. I guess I should also say, man, after 30 hours of travel, maybe it's not that good an idea to take the microphone right off the bat and say anything. But let me go on to both Evan and Burke brought up document-based data exchange in slightly different ways. Evan talked about exchanging specific focused sets of data, and Burke brought up the idea of using CDAs to exchange data. And so again, just like tying that to experience, we've been using CDAs to exchange patient-level case report data, and we've thought a lot about sort of how to expand that set of data in a richer CDA for exchanging full clinical summaries. We've also thought about how to trim that CDA and exchange and use it as the vehicle to exchange subsets, like demographic data, for instance. And again, the size of that packet, the richness of the clinical data that you would exchange in a different setting really reflects the specific business rules, the specific business case for exchanging data. And that's what I've heard many different people up here talking about in one way or another, is trying to I guess in summary I'd say there's sort of two ways to approach these problems. One is to look at, we have a network of clinics, we're trying to implement OpenMRS, we want to decide one server or several. Another way to look at it is sort of from the top down and say there's some kind of network of data flow that you're trying to create, and what are the right tools to use for that. And so if there's interest here in discussing that sort of standards-based, document-based approach to sharing data, I think that would be great, and I'd love to see that happen over the next couple days. If there's interest in discussing synchronization more broadly than sort of as a way to, how do we get two servers with poor connectivity to work together? I think there's a broader purpose for synchronization also. So, thanks.
Yeah, my name is Ada Young. I'm from Regenstrief Institute and also from AMPAC in Kenya. Our challenges, the main one is how to come up with the derived concept. For example, when someone asks you how many patients are pregnant currently, actually there's so many different ways to define it. For example, you would think just a pregnancy test, but sometimes that question might not be answered or entered into the system for whatever reason. And it could be like to say there's some like a prenatal care supplements or maybe the fetal height and other different concepts based on. And we really need some kind of tools to help us to better manage in this area before we can even provide a better answer to our clinicians or our reporting agency.
I had one small comment about sync, and I think it's a slight missed opportunity in terms of building a usable audit trail for all data inside of OpenMRS, because essentially that's what sync is doing. It's writing to these XML files that get passed around, and I think that any sort of low-level technical discussion should, there's the potential for that to sort of solve the audit system question. So I mean, I hope that doesn't get overlooked in the sync talk.
Question for you, Ada. Is it wrong to, in the case that you've found, in the case that you've determined through some other ways that a patient is pregnant, even though is the patient pregnant question was never asked on the form?
No, we do have a question like, is the patient is pregnant or not? Sometimes it may be like a data entry error that, or it might not be captured for whatever reason into the system.
So my question is, though, is it wrong once you have determined that definitely they are pregnant to just go back and create that observation and say, actually, they are pregnant?
We haven't really go through that, down the road, because it's just, for example, like we want to capture to best describe, to answer this question, is the patient pregnant, for example? And we, whether maybe like they receive some antenatal care services, and then it can be like one way to define that this patient is pregnant during this time or something. So that we want to have like a better way to capture, to define, to answer one question. Just think about like, is the patient pregnant? It's a simple question, but it's not that simple to answer this question.
Before I sit down, I guess I can just say one way that we've approached that in our implementation in Malawi is we just try to come up with what our one definition of the answer is, and then we try to have a couple of other things that might point to that answer. And we tend to run like a data quality report, which would just check that those two things would match. So a totally different example would just be that a patient's assigned a first-line drug regimen, and on a form it indicates that they're on an alternative first-line drug regimen. So we would say that that person's on a first-line drug regimen because that's it's the regimen that we actually use as the answer. But we would flag it as an error just to say we should check this.
So like, for example, when new forms come in, and how do you like do the maintenance, to keep up with your data checking?
Well, we actually run the data checks every time that the data enterers are entering the form. So at the end of the day, they actually run the data checks on the things that they've entered. And they should always see that error exists, and they should try to correct it.
So one of the things that this raises actually a couple of different issues. I think probably, and one of the areas that MVP is particularly interested in is the idea of concepts and managing concepts and there are different strategies for doing that, which is a little different from your question. I want to touch on both of them. So MVP standardizes its concepts in a central way and then pushes them out in each country in different languages so that we do have some control over what concepts are being used to capture which concept. But the issue about these kind of meta concepts or derived, I think you used the term derived concepts. I think someone, maybe Darius could talk about the use of programs or states for patients, and that patients can go and come out of a state. So they may be pregnant now, but then they had a delivery and they actually are no longer pregnant. So you want to make sure you know that. And keeping that separate from the concepts that are recorded on a given encounter, which in some ways is kind of, I mean, from the United States, so we have this medical legal notion, but it's more than that. It's actually trying to capture what happened during that encounter. So the other sort of strategy for combining concepts is to use a common reference term that would allow you to say, you know, that this has been captured in several different ways on different forms, but they all map to the same standard concept. And so this is another thing that we want to talk about this week, is the use of SNOMED and some of these reference terms as a way to cross different forms with different types of questions, but that ultimately map to the same thing. And this also applies to when you want a diabetes patient. I mean, do you want type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes or any kind of diabetes patients? It's that kind of subsumption query, or being able to capture the whole hierarchy.
Did you want me to answer that?
Well, I thought specifically about is anyone using the states and programs?
Yeah, so, well, maybe someone who's at, I had a lot to do with the design of those, and although I would say that, you know, we were trying to solve a specific problem, which was really more about administrative information about patients, stuff that's not really a medical observation, but rather like what clinic are they assigned to? What, you know, are they registered versus approved versus completed or something like that? So that was really the original intention. Since then, I think many people have ended up using workflows and states to represent a lot more than that. And to represent things like, is a patient on antiretrovirals, when really, you know, that should be something that is calculated on, like, you should just look, are they on antiretrovirals, rather than having someone need to manually go and shift them into that state. And so I think, I mean, there's reasons why people have done that, just because there wasn't really a good alternative at the time. So I think that the way those are used right now is not the best way, and it's not necessarily the best way to do what you're describing. I think we need to finish building the capability to do the query, is the patient on antiretrovirals, and have that be calculated sort of on the fly in some way that you're able to describe. So logic is going to be really, I think, the best way to solve that problem, rather than trying to do it with.
Would you store that metadata somewhere or would you essentially be calculating it dynamically at the very moment you need it, and then you dispose of it?
Yeah, you would cache it for a while, but you would be calculating it when you need it. And I think that's presumably what your data quality reports look like, is that, you know, at the end of the day you go through and run the report, and it runs a bunch of rules basically and figures out, here are things that are wrong. People go correct those, the ones that they can, then they run the report again, and hopefully now there's no errors.
Yeah, I mean, real quick, and then I'll pass the mic. The BAVEB guys again aren't here, but they're rolling out a national ART system right now in Malawi, which has these pretty complicated cohort reports, which are trying to answer a lot of these questions. And we're actually looking at ways that we might remodel this data a little bit right now. They're calculating the state on ARTs based on like a drug regimen or based on a visit. There's a couple other things that are all pointing to this one thing, and they're finding that it's really, really slow. It takes, especially with the larger data sets, it takes a very long time to run these reports, and they're trying to run them so they display in real time on a touchscreen. And so you can imagine if it takes a couple of minutes, that's a pretty frustrating process. So we're really trying to move over towards like catching the data, and we thought about the patient state being like the way to do it. You know, we've been sort of doing them as patient state means, you know, or patient program means that you're supposed to be coming in for treatment at a location on a regular basis or something like that, and or you've stopped, and the reason you've stopped is a death or a default or a transfer out. And so we found, just using those patient states and using the cohort builder, that we can make their queries run instantly. And so that's just one other perspective on that.
One other thing, if I can add on to that too, is also being able to capture a history of patient states. So like, for example, the average time that somebody's on pre-art before they come into art, it's harder to calculate that than to just say this is the day that they started on the pre-art treatment status and this is the day they finished and then they moved into some other stage.
And just, I think that the other thing you mentioned that is really hard though is that it's really easy for a data clerk to forget to update a state. And so that's one of the big reasons why we had to come up with some of these data quality reports. And it would be great if they didn't even have to do it, if the logic service was there to update it automatically based on something that had happened.
I'm going to go sit down now, but I hope that someone comes up and before this session is over tells about something they've recently implemented that's running really well and they love it.
I want to
Well, I'm not
finish
gonna
the
sit down
idea
so that-
of the health concept of Darius, because I think you brought a very good issue about OpenMRS, and it was designed for administration purposes. Therefore, in a sense, we're really dealing with secondary data. And I think that's fair to say that OpenMRS can deliver that. Through the maturity process, though, when we're working in Latin America, then yes, it is delivering what the government wants, the third parties, or the external factor from a clinical environment is meeting that requirement. But the health concept that Andy was talking about the SNOME CT, about how close we get to a clinical reality, I think is the next level for the OpenMRS, is to bring the health concept in a standardized manner that way we reduce errors in the clinical practice. Because as you say here, we all humans and we got different interpretation of what a concept means. And as you say very clearly, OpenMRS have defined very well those concepts in a different level than pure clinical, because that was the issue at the time. But through the evolution of OpenMRS, I believe the health concept itself have to come from the health science itself, in order than the data. We don't waste resources. We don't have in checking the quality of data all the time, because it's come from a solid reference model or information model that you have in mind based on the cognitive process of a healthcare professional. That's my belief at this time, and my experience anyway.
No, I think you're right that there are many different levels to it. There's asking the right question, getting people to answer it right, getting someone to put that correct answer into an electronic system correctly, making sure that it agrees with every other thing that's in the system. I mean, there's so many steps along the way, and there are many ways that we should be attacking the problem at each stage.
Just on the experience, a very good experience, a very positive experience with OpenMRS has been the MDR-TB module. And for those people who are running TB programs, and especially MDR-TB programs, I mean, this has been an incredible tool for ourselves in Pakistan. We have over 150 or so patients, completely entered into the module. And what we've really appreciated about it is the way it sort of presents reports within the modules, the data that's been entered. So it summarizes the medicines patients are on. It tells you if there's any contraindications for that patient to be on that medicine. It really puts all the lab, the field data, the contact tracing, all together in one what I think is very robust module. And I think it's just a great example of the kind of reporting and functionality that we wish we could sort of, make ourselves or have other people contribute to the broader OpenMRS. And I just want to acknowledge the support that we've got from Dave, Darius, and Hamish for using it. I know, for example, the person in our team, Owais, who is not here, fortunately, has spent a lot of time with Dave really troubleshooting and making it run. But once you get it running, it has been an incredible experience, and we're actually now presenting this at the GLC forum next month to share the GLC, which is associated with MDR-TB control, to share with countries in Central Asia and in Europe. And I think it's going to become increasingly common for more and more of these MDR-TV programs to actually need these running, and perhaps even have the GLC recommend strongly that MDR-TV programs use that particular module. So I think it's just a great example. If you haven't seen it, maybe we can have somebody show it here or in the next few days. So thank you for that, OpenMRS.
Actually, I want to pick up on that thread a little bit, because one of the things I've noticed in the implementations that we've been involved with at WHO is that there's a tension that's emerging in different types of implementations between those implementations that feel we have to go through a lengthy and laborious customizations of the forms process, and those implementations that say, no, actually what we need is a pre-configured system where we can skip that stage and just get on the ground running. And one of the business cases behind the MDR-TB module is if we have our clinical guidelines, we don't necessarily need to go through that iterative process with the clinical staff to design unique forms and all that. We can actually start, with the MDR-TB forms, pre-configured into the system. And what I've noticed is that in those areas like Western Kenya with AMPATH, where you have literally a model of care, there is a desire to go through that customization period to make sure that, as Carol said, it maps intuitively to the way clinicians view the workflow. But then you have many, many other clinics that basically say, here are our WHO guidelines. We're dealing in a volume business here. We don't have the time to wait 18 months or 6 months to get started. We need to get started now. So I guess my question for this group is, in your implementations, maybe by a show of hands, how many people went through an individual customization process with their forms? Okay, now my second follow-up question to you, of the people that raised their hands, how many people were able to complete that process within 6 months? 1? Wow. 2. See, now how many people here, let me ask the reverse question, how many people here actually had a pre-configured system where once installed, they could start collecting data right away? MDR-TB. And at WHO, we're also working with an HIV version that has the IMAI guidelines pre-configured, which we're pilot testing in Uganda. How many people would like to have a pre-configured system? Okay, this is an interesting data point. Maybe we can develop that in some of the modules. Anyway, I just wanted to share that experience and get some feedback from the group on that, because I think it's a critical development issue. Actually, yeah, Roger, I think, is working in this area as well on maternal and child health. Is that right?
Well, actually, we're going to try and start with ARV, and at least get the interlinked indicators into it, and hopefully integrate that with the existing maternal or perinatal forms, is sort of what we're trying to do. And I guess if the style of practice is IMAI, then maybe the ARV module works. But if you have a place where they haven't adopted IMAI, then you basically have to go through at least some sort of customization. And what you can try and do, I know that if just looking at some of the modules, a lot of them have described global concepts and used that to identify the concepts that are going to be tallied, while others require the use of their own concept library because their reports and stuff are keyed off of predefined concept numbers. So maybe there ought to be some discussion by people at the lower coding level as to what are the costs of having some sort of a mapping layer in between versus having to use predefined concept numbers.
Yeah, we want that layer. I don't think anyone's going to disagree there amongst the coders. What I was going to say is there's also a sort of a halfway, I mean, there's something in between having a completely pre-configured system and starting from scratch with nothing. And this is certainly not what we did when we started working at PIH, but I wish we could have sort of started from sort of a lot more of a, here is 90% of what we think you need, and you have to customize 10%, turns out to be 20, 30%, whatever, but a lot of it is there already, and you don't have to literally do everything from scratch. And people don't have to be arguing about if people just argued about 5 questions on a form instead of, 30, maybe it would just take 6 months instead of years.
So I don't, sorry to be up here at the front again, but I think I'd just like to respond quickly to some of the comments just now. As for people who are not so familiar with OpenMRS, I think it's a really important distinction to make that there are a number of systems that are used, other than OpenMRS, that are used to collect data, for example, on HIV or TB patients, that are very specific vertical systems designed sometimes very well to deal with that particular problem. The goal of the type of work that Chris Bailey is describing at WHO, and also to a great extent the module we produced for MDR-TB, was to capture that specific functionality where there was a clearly defined set of forms and reports, and that we could therefore hide a lot of the complexity and the configurability of OpenMRS underneath a layer of really the key functions. It doesn't take away the ability to extend the system once you've actually got it running, but the idea is not to go through the entire configuration process from the beginning. So I think it's important in terms of the challenges we're talking about here, a lot of what we're describing with things like synchronization and derived concepts are very much about how you build a very sophisticated system. But you shouldn't get away from the idea that OpenMRS can be used as similar to a vertical system. You've got one disease like HIV, you've got to manage that. The difference is that once you've installed it, you can then go and add other modules, add other functionality, add more concepts, and extend that out. But I think we, as an organization, have not focused so much, and maybe not done a good enough job in capturing key functionality and packaging it well. And that's something that, for example, in any kind of rollout we want to do to a broader community, we need to be very clear that the forms have to be very tightly designed, that there needs to be a limited number of reports, some for data quality, some, for example, for government reporting, and also for local data use in the clinic. And we start with that very tightly defined functionality, and we only upgrade it once every 6 months or a year, depending on a process.
Right, and just a final comment from me, it'd be really nice to see IMCI or IMAI as a module that sort of, just the way MDR-TB is endorsed by the WHO in some ways, you could sort of go and just download it. And I think for a lot of smaller organizations that might not have the IT capabilities that all of these groups here have, that would be they just want to be able to collect IMCI data. And I'm sure within all the implementations that exist in this room, we all have some or all components of IMCI already integrated into our systems. But why not just like the MDR-TB module have perhaps a IMCI or IMAI module that's ready-made for you to download and start working on.
Well, if you want to answer that, I'm going to take it a different direction.
Oh yeah, before Bert takes it into a different direction. For those here who think there is some value in this partial pre-configuration along the lines of pre-established guidelines like IMCI or others, please come and see me, because one of the things that we'd like to do with our limited time and resources is identify what are those specific areas that are the logical next steps. Are they malaria? Is it childhood illnesses? What could we add to that suite of tools that can be installed more quickly and speed up that implementation process? And I also would like to highlight one of the issues that Hamish brought up, because I think it's a critical issue conceptually, and that's the difference between a simple system and a simple interface. That oftentimes what I'm seeing in country, because I'm often working with ministries of health on the decision-making process of of what systems to use, what systems to encourage, and how one goes about that. Too often the debate boils down to a false choice between a simple and complex system. In fact, this even came up in Atlanta last week at the Public Health Informatics Network conference at the CDC, where the new head of the CDC, after working in India for a while with EpiInfo, and that was his, I think, the extent of his informatics experience. Sorry about that, CDC folks. I can neither confirm nor deny what I just said. But, or maybe I can. But at any rate, he stated in plenary in his keynote speech that based on that experience, he thinks that most systems out there are too complex and we should only use simple systems. And that was his underlying message. And then afterwards, it was opened up for Q&A, and okay, yes, I am a troublemaker, and I stirred the pot. But I got up in front of the plenary, and I said, you know what? We should be very careful with statements like that, because a lot of people interpret that as, oh, we should only use access-based systems. I said, in our field, working in Africa or other resource-poor settings, the process of delivering antiretroviral care to people living with HIV is a complex proposition. And either that system manages that complexity, or with a simple system, we simply push that back onto the overburdened healthcare worker. So let's, in striving for simplicity, make sure that we understand that beneath the hood, in order to make that user interface simple, we often have to invest in a system that can manage that complexity. And if we get trapped at just the notion of, well, I just want to see a simple form and therefore slap it onto Access, we're actually coming up with simplistic solutions, which is not the direction that we want to go. So all that said and done, as Hamish correctly summarized, and I am now making more lengthy and complicated, what we're trying to do with these pre-configured systems is not to go backwards to vertical systems, but rather to say, we've got a primary care system that uses a patient-centric data model approach, but we can build these vertical views on that. So it's actually a single system with different views, not multiple vertical systems that get, you know, jerry-rigged together.
So I asked Burke if I could grab the microphone on the way over to him. I just wanted to, and he said, oh, all right. He's a nice guy. It's just the way it is. Anyway, one very quick comment to follow on Chris's, and that is that you know, the U.S. healthcare system is almost never an example of anything positive, and so here's another example of how it's not very positive. For years, the rate of adoption of electronic medical records in the States has been slowed by the fact that every institution sees itself as a unique and uniquely complex care delivery system, and any kind of implementation starts with a lengthy requirements gathering process that shows exactly how much money is going to need to be spent to tailor a system. That's starting to change in the States with this big push through the ARA and high-tech acts, and so there is some odd balance there, because you know, you're right that a simple system pushes complexity onto the user, and it's also the case that you know, a complex and infinitely tailorable system gives the users so many options that nothing can ever get implemented, and so there is sort of an odd balance there.
Okay, and now for something completely different. All right, well, I'm a little, this is nice, it's been good conversation, but I can't help but notice the too many Wazungu up here, and I, yeah, there goes one. They, how many people here are, you know, spending at least 3 or 4 days a week hands-on touching an OpenMRS system, a production system, either entering data or managing data, doing reports, dealing with the data managers and stuff? Do we have folks like that here? Is that, we have 4, 5? Okay, we have People don't want to admit to it because they know what I'm going to say next.
What about 2 days a week?
I'm mindful that we only have about 20 minutes left in this session, and one of my real hopes for this session was to try to get folks that are really hands-on dealing with the system to get up here, fetch, complain, talk about what could be better. I would ask you, what are, if there are 2 or 3 things that you could change about the system just to make, yeah, I mean, do we have a data manager or someone doing data entry? Just if there's a feature or a couple features that you would say, you know what, if this little thing, if this word up here changed to that, or if when I click this button it did something a little different, it would make me 10 times more productive. And I guess what I'm looking for is I'd like to make sure we get out of this experience really what the day in the life of someone dealing with implementation is dealing with. Speaking from experience, because I feel like we have a lot to learn from that. So that's my spiel. I would urge you to get up here and we only have 20 minutes and just throw out some thoughts in terms of here's how I think the system could be improved.
Okay, I'm Evelyn, data manager in Ampath, Kenya. Oh, okay, I'm in charge of data quality and reporting. I know I've had so many challenges, like in data quality, the way OpenMRS, I think the way it stores its data, it's an observation for every concept. So at the end of the day, you have to okay, what I do, I use SAS, I extract everything from the system, and then I'm able to put it in a flat table, and then do a query to check across the concepts, so that for me to be able to query and see whether the skip patterns of the form was adhered to. So that's how I do it. For reporting, the challenge is being able to define the indicators. We have very complex indicators that come in through PEPFAB, through the individual programs that Ampath is running. So sometimes you find you're given to define a particular indicator. I'll just give you an example. If it's lost to follow-up, somebody is lost to follow-up. If they are on ARVs, we'll calculate at the end of the reporting period, if they are on ARVs, we look 3 months back. If they're not on ARVs, we have to look from the end of the reporting period, 6 months back. So you have to combine different derived concepts for you to define that indicator. I know that's a very challenging thing, because sometimes somebody okay, they might be lost to follow-up, but they moved out of the program. So would you still define them as lost to follow-up? And yet, yeah, they're lost to follow-up, but then again, they moved out of the program. They are no longer into care. Or for patients, for children below 5 years, if they were tested and then they were found to be HIV negative, yeah, they are no longer in the program. How would you define that in your indicator? So I would wish if the system was set in such a way that you'd feed in all those particular derived concepts. Yeah, you derive the concepts, you feed them into the system, and then you have a template for the particular report that you're interested in. You can define your template, then define the individual indicators, and then the concepts that go into those individual indicators, and then run and you get your report. I think that would be a good thing to do. Yeah.
If there was a way to limit system resource consumption for the cohort builder and the data export so that they wouldn't consume all of the resources, let it take a minute longer, but let people do searches, users do searches for patients, let them keep being able to pull up the InfoPath form to fill it out. So that would be something that would really be beneficial. Darius also asked a question, what did you just do that really worked well? So we just integrated our community health data into OpenMRS, which makes it available in the hospital for someday when doctors actually are in front of the computers to see the history from the dispensary level into the hospital level. And that was possible because of the MRN Gen module and the security that we did on the tribe field. So, thank you.
Okay, I'm Khalihara working with Partners in Health from Lesotho. I work as a data manager. And in my experience, I've noticed that most of our data clerks based on sites keep on repeating similar mistakes over time. And it would be helpful if, for some things like unique identities, would have alerts that strictly says this is not correct if you enter it like this, and then that would really be helpful, and it would limit the errors that happens most, because that's where they mostly go wrong. And it would also be helpful if, like, we won't have to update one thing most of the time, like repeatedly. We would know that if the patient has been stopped on the regimen, then the status would automatically change to stop, that we wouldn't have to change twice of the similar thing. That would be helpful. Because also due to great load that they are working with, bundles of patients, too much of them, they sometimes forget to change these things, all of them.
I'm Tyson Liboma from PH Malawi. I'm working as data manager. My experience in OpenMRS as data manager. We don't have like much problem to say. We're able to capture our data, and then when data is entered, there are some reports that have been developed or designed to catch all those errors that are common. So in terms of like error tracking and then like editing or correcting those errors, I think with those reports that have been designed, working hand in hand with Evan, I think they're helping us a lot to catch all errors that come up during data entry. Just to concur my colleague here, maybe it would be better if somebody maybe has changed regimen to another regimen. I don't know if there would be any specific idea like to update that automatically. Say somebody was on T30 and then maybe has changed to maybe a second line regimen, and then when entering the data, maybe should update it, saying this patient was T30 and then now is in the second line regimen. Maybe that also be, that will help as well. Thank you.
One thing that I think might be helpful would be the ability to customize what you see whenever you first click on a patient. For example, in terms of the tabs and patient overviews, so that you can decide what's important to roll up to that level, and then what needs to be drilled down into a form. So there's, for example, if you want to make a single update on a particular data point, it might be easy to be able to go in somewhere into the system and customize it so that you can bring that up instead of always having to go into a particular form or create a new form or whatever it is. So just generally customization of the way the patient overview looks.
So I'm Cheryl Amoroso from PH Rwanda, and to give context to the way we're working, we're using our EMR in 12 Ministry of Health centers. We have 7 servers that are synchronized, and some of our sites don't have power yet. So we're doing a mix of things that probably a lot of other people are doing as well. And my comment is generally about usability, and we have clinicians directly accessing our system for a year. In one of our sites, we've had clinicians doing patient lookups, and through a recent grant from the CDC, we've just been able to fund laptops for all of our HIV consultation rooms, and those are being rolled out in the last few weeks. Now that we have clinicians touching the EMR, looking at OpenMRS, we're coming up against new challenges. We want clinicians to be able to think of things they want to research and be able to use Cohort Builder comfortably, be able to do data exports, because at the moment a lot of our research is driven by Boston, by outsiders, and we really want our doctors and nurses thinking of these things, because the more they start touching the data, getting excited, we'll have good data and we'll have things that we're using. The reaction has been really positive, and a lot of people in Rwanda are very keen to get their hands on a computer and be able to get that experience. So it's going well, but we're coming up against a limitation. Trying to explain the current Cohort Builder to a team of 25 nurses, I realized just how tricky it is, and it's the same with our data officers. So you have to get sort of a certain level of understanding of the system before you can use that. So we'd love to see that be more usable for general.
So do you now have a point-of-care system in Rwanda?
Say that we do, yes.
Okay, well, I think we are naturally coming to a good transition point. What I'd like to do now is hand over the microphone to Chris to talk a little bit about how lunch is going to work and then what's going to happen this afternoon.